The sound came first, metal scraping against metal sharp. Ugly, deliberate. Go ahead, the father said loudly, waving a hand toward the door. Break it open. He doesn't own this place. The locksmith froze for half a second, glancing around at the crowd gathering on the stone driveway. Phones were already up. Someone's camera flash popped by accident, followed by muffled laughter. He stood a few steps away from the door, not blocking it, not defending himself, just standing there. The house behind him was impossible to ignore. Clean white walls, tall glass windows catching the late afternoon light, dark wood panels sharp enough to look unreal. The kind of house people slowed their cars for. The kind people whispered about before even seeing inside. And yet now it was being treated like a lie. You don't mind, do you? His father added, turning halfway toward the guests. This generation invents stories. Better to clear things up. A few people chuckled. Others stared openly, curious, entertained. The young man kept his hands at his sides. His fingers didn't shake. His breathing stayed even. He didn't look at the locksmith, or the door, or the phones pointed at him. He looked at the ground. Someone whispered, not quietly enough. Why would he pretend something like this? Another voice answered, amused, attention. Always attention. His mother stood near the back, twisting her scarf in her hands, eyes darting between her husband and her son. She opened her mouth once, then closed it again. The father stepped closer to the locksmith, gold watch sliding down his wrist, confidence sitting heavy on his shoulders. I raised him, he said. I know exactly how much he earns. Small jobs, temporary work. Nothing wrong with that. He paused, smiling thinly. But don't insult people by pretending you suddenly bought a house like this. A ripple of approval ran through the group. Heads nodded. Someone murmured, fair enough. The locksmith cleared his throat. Sir, I need confirmation before. Break the lock, the father interrupted. If it's really his house, I'll apologize. In front of everyone, the word apologize sounded more like a joke than a promise. The crowd leaned in. Hungry now. He finally lifted his head. Dad, he said quietly. His voice didn't rise. It didn't wobble. You don't need to do this. That only made it worse. Oh, the father laughed. Then stop embarrassing yourself. You think silence makes this convincing? A cousin smirked. Another guest whispered, typical. He took half a step back, instinctive, like someone trying to make himself smaller without realizing it. His shoulders lowered. His gaze slid away again. Not fear, something closer to restraint. Inside him, there was no panic, only a dull pressure in his chest, the kind that came from being cornered not physically, but publicly. He had imagined this moment differently. Not the locksmith, not the crowd, not his life turned into entertainment. The father crossed his arms. Open it. The locksmith hesitated, clearly uncomfortable now. Tools clinked softly in his bag. Then a voice cut in from the side, smooth and amused. All right, a neighbor said, stepping forward with a grin. Expensive suit, careless confidence. Before we turn this into a crime scene, why so serious? A few people laughed, relieved. The neighbor's eyes moved over the house, then back to the young man. Curious now, calculating. Look, he continued, gesturing casually, everyone's already here. Why not have a little fun with it? The father turned. Fun? The man snapped his fingers, and someone nearby produced a folded chessboard from a table meant for drinks. He placed it down between them like a prop already rehearsed. Just a game, the neighbor said lightly. Distraction while we wait. The word just asterisk floated through the air. The young man stiffened, not much. Just enough that someone watching closely might notice. Chess. The neighbor smiled wider. You play, right? He didn't answer immediately. He shook his head once, subtle. I'm working, he said. That's not necessary. The neighbor laughed. Come on. Unless you're scared. A few laughs followed. The father smirked, satisfied. Even chess isn't his strength. Something shifted, then not in the crowd, but in him. A quiet tightening, a line drawn not for pride, but for dignity. He looked up. Not at the neighbor. Not at the chessboard. At the door. And for the first time, instead of backing away, he sat down. The chessboard hit the marble table with a sharp clap. Relax, the neighbor said. laughing as if he'd just told a harmless joke. It's just a game, someone poured champagne. The pop of the cork sounded almost celebratory. A few guests gathered closer, drawn by the promise of spectacle more than the board itself. Phones tilted, framing the table now instead of the door. The locksmith stepped back. Forgotten for the moment, the young man remained standing. "I said no," he replied calmly. Not loud, not challenging. His voice carried the weight of someone used to being ignored and choosing his battles carefully. The neighbor looked pleased, like a cat watching a mouse hesitate. "You don't have to prove anything," he said, sweetly. "Unless you want to." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. The father leaned in, resting one hand on the table. "See," he said to the guests. "He knows." The young man's eyes flicked toward his mother. She stood very still, hands clasped tight, her face pale. She shook her head just slightly, not in warning, but in fear of what might happen if he embarrassed himself further. The neighbor followed his gaze and smiled. "All right," he said. "Let's make it simple. One game, 10 minutes. You lose, we stop pretending." "Pretending what?" the young man asked. "That this house is yours," the neighbor replied smoothly. A few people gasped. Most laughed. The young man stepped back again, palms open, a reflex meant to calm tension. "This doesn't change anything." "Oh, it changes everything," the neighbor said. "Here." He pulled out his phone and flashed it vaguely. "If you win, I'll tell your father you're a genius. I'll even apologize." The word apologize echoed again, empty as the first time it had been used tonight. The father snorted. "Let him try. It'll end faster," someone from the back called out. "Show him how real chess is played." The neighbor sat down, already confident, already comfortable. He adjusted his cufflinks, straightened the board, and spun one of the pieces absent-mindedly between his fingers. "White or black?" he asked. The young man didn't respond. He took a slow breath, eyes drifting away from the table toward the house again. Toward the door everyone seemed so eager to break. "I really don't want to," he said quietly. The neighbor leaned back, grinning. "Scared?" The word landed like a shove. The young man's jaw tightened. Not from anger. From restraint pushed too far. "I'm not scared," he replied. "Then play." Silence crept in. Not complete. Glasses clinked. Someone coughed, but thinner now, expectant. He stood there a moment longer than felt comfortable. Long enough for the crowd to start shifting, murmuring again, ready to mock him for hesitating. Then he nodded. Once. Double quotes. "No money," he said. "No nonsense," the neighbor laughed. "Listen to him." He turned to the crowd. "He thinks he's negotiating." The young man pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, deliberately. His movements were precise, not rehearsed, not showy. As if he'd done this exact thing many times before, the neighbor waved a hand. "White's yours. Go ahead." A few people chuckled. A few rolled their eyes. The father folded his arms again. Confidence fully returned. To him, this was over already. Another lesson learned in public. The young man placed his hands on the table. For a moment, he didn't touch the pieces. He studied the board, not nervously, not curiously, but with familiarity that hadn't been there moments before. His fingers hovered, then withdrew, then rested again, perfectly still. The neighbor tapped the table impatiently. "Anytime now." The young man finally moved. The pawn slid forward, clean, straight. "Unhesiting. Pawn to E for. The sound of it clicking into place quieted the chatter more than anyone expected. The neighbor blinked, then laughed loudly. "Bold," he said, already reaching for his own piece. "I like confidence." He slammed his pawn forward in reply. "C5, someone murmured, half recognition, half guess. "The Sicilian defense," the neighbor announced proudly, as if performing for an imagined audience beyond the crowd. "Let's make this interesting." The young man didn't respond with words. He answered on the board. Another clean movement. Another silent reply. No dramatic pause. No hesitation. Just precision. Woman near the table leaned closer, lowering her glass. "Wait," she whispered. The neighbor kept smiling, but his laughter came a fraction too late. After each move now, his eyes weren't wandering anymore. They were fixed on the board. Still, he scoffed. "Beginner's luck." The young man said nothing. Inside him, the world narrowed, not in panic, but in focus. The noise, the crowd, the door. All of it faded into the background. There was only the board now, and the neighbor had no idea this was not the first time his hands had rested her heavy pawn moved against smooth. Deliberate, not fast, not unsure, as if the board already belonged to him. The neighbor tilted his head, still smiling, but his fingers paused longer than before over his next move. Round them, the crowd had shifted. People leaned in, glasses lowered, laughter thinning into curiosity. The young man's shoulders stayed relaxed. His breathing never changed. The neighbor broke the quiet with a chuckle. You've memorized a few openings, huh? He spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, reclaiming the performance. Good start. Won't save you. He pushed a piece forward with unnecessary force. The wood clicked sharply. The young man responded almost immediately, knight stepping out with quiet purpose. No drama, no second thought. A man near the table frowned. That was quick. The father waved it off. Anyone can copy moves, but the neighbor's grin tightened. The rhythm of the game was no longer his. The room had been barely wider than the mattress on the floor. A single bulb flickered overhead, buzzing softly as if even it was tired. The young man sat cross-legged, a chipped ceramic mug beside him, steam rising from tea he'd forgotten to drink. The chessboard in front of him wasn't complete. Two pawns were mismatched coins. One rook had been replaced by a broken bottle cap. The board itself was cardboard, hand-drawn lines uneven, corners fraying, but the pieces still moved. He replayed games he'd watched online late at night, pausing videos whenever the internet lagged. Sometimes he guessed the next move before it played. Sometimes he was wrong and he stayed up until he understood why. Outside, laughter leaked in from a neighbor's apartment. Inside, he was counting variations, tracing invisible lines with his finger, imagining positions he'd never seen in real life. His phone buzzed once, a reminder for a shift in 2 hours. He ignored it. He reset the board. Again. The neighbor leaned back in his chair, pretending ease. You're quiet, he said. That's fine. Chess is about confidence. He reached out and made a flashy move, sliding a piece deep into the young man's side of the board. A few guests nodded approvingly. Bold. Someone said. The young man didn't retreat. He didn't rush either. He studied the position for less than 5 seconds, then calmly sacrificed a pawn. A soft tick. A woman's eyebrows lifted. Why would he give that up? The neighbor laughed loudly. Mistake, he said, quick to claim it. You don't recover from those. He captured it with enthusiasm, too much enthusiasm. The young man's eyes narrowed, not in concern, but in calculation. Rain against a window that wouldn't close fully. He stood in a public hallway after work. Uniform still damp, phone balanced on a mop bucket. A match streamed quietly. 2 grandmasters, playing for nothing but respect. He rewound the same moment again and again. See? A voice had said once, months ago. Someone older. Someone who didn't stay. That pawn isn't weak. It's bait. The hallway lights flickered. His phone battery dropped to red. He smiled then, just slightly. The young man's knight leaped forward, cutting across the board like a blade. The move was clean, efficient. Conversation stopped. The neighbor froze, hand halfway to his mouth. He leaned in, scanning the position again, then again. That's. He muttered, trailing off. The father straightened. His confident posture shifted, just a little. Round them, the crowd pressed closer without realizing it. Someone bumped a chair. No one laughed. The neighbor sat upright now, posture rigid. The joking was gone from his eyes. You're setting something up, he said, more accusation than question. The young man finally spoke. No, he replied softly. You already did. Silence. The neighbor made his next move slower, cautious now, fingers tracing squares before committing. When he pushed the piece forward, the sound it made was dull. The young man answered instantly. Queen sliding into position, not aggressive, not flashy, but threatening in a way that felt invisible until it wasn't. A man near the back whispered, That blocks everything. The neighbor's jaw clenched. Beginner, he said again. But the word no longer carried weight. The father's eyes moved between the board and his son, searching for something familiar and finding nothing. A small tournament room. Cheap tables. Folding chairs. The young man sat alone while others clustered together, laughing. Someone glanced at him and looked away. He won his match. Then another dot. By the end of the day, he stood holding a paper certificate and nothing else. A man offered him a card. Training, exposure. He shook his head. I can't, he'd said. I have to work. The man frowned. You're wasting something. The young man folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his bag. Not wasting, he replied. Saving. The neighbor swallowed. He looked up not at the board but at the young man's face. Searching now. Where did you learn this? He asked. The young man didn't answer. He made his next move, the calmest one yet. And for the first time since the game began, someone in the crowd whispered, not in mockery, but in disbelief, that wasn't a beginner move. The neighbor stared at the board. And slowly and willingly realized he was playing defense. No, someone murmured from the edge of the crowd, that's not a beginner move. The words weren't loud, but they carried. They slid between the players and settled on the board like weight. The neighbor laughed too quickly. Relax, he said, brushing it off with a wave. Cute trick. Nothing more, but he didn't lean back anymore. He leaned forward. The young man sat still, elbows close to his sides, hands folded loosely in his lap while it was the other man's turn. His eyes never left the board. His breathing stayed slow, measured. If there was tension in him, it didn't reach the surface. Around them, the mood had shifted. Glasses that had been lifted in amusement were now held forgotten at chest level. Conversations died mid-sentence. People craned their necks, instinctively sensing something had changed. The neighbor cleared his throat and moved his bishop, aiming deep, aggressive, confident by habit rather than certainty. The young man replied immediately, not with a block. Not with a retreat. He slid a piece forward that looked, at first glance, almost harmless. A pause rippled through the crowd. That's risky, a man whispered. The neighbor squinted. He counted, recounted. His fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the table until he hadn't meant to share. You're opening yourself up, he said, half mocking, half warning. That's how people lose fast. The young man finally lifted his eyes not to meet the neighbor's stare, but to glance once at the gathered faces. At the phones now angled lower, more respectful. At his father, whose arms were no longer crossed as tightly as before. Then back to the board. He didn't argue. The neighbor took the bait. He pushed forward, capturing with confidence that felt rehearsed rather than earned. Thank you, he said, smiling thinly. I'll take that. A few people nodded, relieved. Someone laughed softly, grateful for the return of balance, but the young man didn't react. He hadn't even shifted in his chair. With quiet certainty, he moved his knight. The piece landed with a small final click. The room inhaled as one. A woman near the table lowered her glass completely. Wait, doesn't that? Yes, came a calm, unfamiliar voice from behind the crowd. It does. Heads turned. A man stepped forward from the edge of the gathering, older, composed, dressed simply compared to the rest. He had the posture of someone used to watching instead of performing. His eyes rested on the board, not the players. The neighbor glanced up, annoyed. Sorry, who? The man didn't answer right away. His gaze traced the position, slow and thoughtful. That night, he said, mostly to himself. It cuts off the escape and pressures the center at the same time. The neighbor laughed again, sharper now. That's a stretch, is it? The man replied evenly. Because if you advance there, he gestured lightly, not touching the board, you lose material. And if you don't, your position suffocates. A few guests exchanged looks. The father took a small step closer. You're saying I'm saying this isn't imitation, the man interrupted, still calm. This is understanding. Silence settled heavier now. The neighbor turned back to the board. His jaw tightened. He reached for a piece, hesitated, pulled his hand back. Reached again. Stop. The young man waited. No tapping. No impatience. Just stillness. Finally, the neighbor moved, careful, conservative. Nothing like his earlier bravado. The young man responded instantly. Queen sliding, not attacking yet. Just asterisk present asterisk. Like a shadow, the neighbor could no longer ignore. The crowd leaned forward almost in unison. Even the locksmith had stopped pretending not to watch. The father's confidence bled away drop by drop. His lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. For the first time, He looked at his son not with irritation, but with confusion. That position? Someone whispered. It's tight. The older man nodded slightly. Very, the neighbor swallowed. You think you're clever, he muttered, trying to reclaim control. But games like this unravel fast. The young man tilted his head just a fraction. Only if you rush, the words landed. Softly and cut deeper than anything he'd said all night. The neighbor's next move was slower, cautious, defensive. The crowd noticed. The older man folded his hands behind his back now, interest sharpened. If he sees it, he said quietly, this ends soon. Sees what? The father asked, almost afraid of the answer. The young man's eyes flickered. Just once to the king trapped behind its own pieces. Then he moved. Not the killing blow. Not yet. He laid the final thread. The neighbor stared at the board. And for the first time, he didn't laugh. The father stopped smiling. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was the quiet kind of change, the kind that happened when certainty cracked and something uncomfortable started leaking through. He leaned closer to the board, eyes narrowing, no longer watching out of obligation, but out of unease. The neighbor shifted in his chair. He adjusted his cuffs again, though they were already straight. His confidence had thinned into something brittle. Think, he muttered to himself, more than anyone else. The board was crowded now. Pieces locked together, tension wound tight. To anyone who didn't know chess, it looked complicated. To anyone who did, it looked dangerous. The young man sat motionless while the neighbors struggled. The bus stop smelled like oil and rain. He stood there before sunrise, backpack heavy with a laptop he'd bought secondhand and books wrapped in plastic to keep them dry. Round him, people scrolled phones, half asleep, headed to jobs they didn't love. He reviewed games in his head instead, openings he couldn't afford to play recklessly, and games he studied during lunch breaks while others joked and ate. Losses he replayed in silence because there was no one to explain them to. At night, he played online under a name no one remembered. He won more than he lost. When messages came, coach, tournament, training, he ignored them. He needed rent money more than rankings, groceries more than glory. Once, someone recognized him across a screen and typed, "You're better than this." He stared at the words for a long time, then clocked into work. Neighbor exhaled sharply and made his move in. Aggressive push meant to break the tension. It was loud, forceful, desperate. The piece landed, the sound echoed. For a moment, the crowd relaxed. A few nods, a murmur, relief. But the older man, still standing a step back, didn't move. His gaze sharpened. No, he said quietly. That's too late. The young man's hand moved, not fast, not slow. Certain. He slid a pawn forward. Just one, a simple move, a death sentence. The neighbor froze. His eyes darted across the board, scanning lines that weren't there before, pathways suddenly blocked, escapes sealed shut by pieces he'd ignored earlier. How? He whispered. The young man spoke softly. You chased the wrong side. The older man nodded. Classic containment, he said. Slow pressure. No panic. A hush fell over the group. Phones rose again, but this time, not to mock, to capture. The father swallowed. His throat felt dry. He searched for something recognizable in his son's posture. Nervousness, excitement, pride. There was none, only focus. First time he walked through the empty rooms, his footsteps echoed. No applause. No celebration. Just keys in his palm, paperwork tucked under his arm. He sat on the floor when it was done, not because he was overwhelmed, but because he finally could. He imagined asking them to come, imagined telling them, then remembered every laugh. Every doubt. He decided silence was easier. The neighbor rubbed his face with both hands. Now, you planned this, he said, accusing. From the opening, the young man nodded once. You gave me time. The neighbor looked up sharply. You tricked me. No, the young man replied. You ignored me. There it was. The father flinched. The older man stepped closer. If I'm not mistaken, he said calmly, this position mirrors a master-level trap, rarely taught, even harder to spot under pressure. A murmur spread. Different now, not laughter, recognition. The neighbor laughed weakly. You saying he's some kind of professional? The older man met his eyes. I'm saying this isn't luck. And it isn't memorization. The neighbor looked back down at the board. No matter what he did, something collapsed. His shoulders sank. I didn't even see it, he admitted. The crowd felt it the moment power shifted irreversibly. The humiliation drained from the young man and soaked into the neighbor instead. The father's voice came out hoarse. Why didn't you tell us? The young man didn't look up from the board. You were too busy explaining who I wasn't. Then quietly he made his move. The board changed instantly. Gasps rippled. The older man straightened. It's force now, he said. One sequence left. The neighbor stared, hands trembling slightly. Check, the young man said, not loud. Not proud, just final. The neighbor leaned back, staring at the ceiling, breath unsteady, and in that moment before the last move even happened, everyone knew they should have looked closer. The word hung in the air like a held breath. Check, no. Shout followed it. No reaction at first. The neighbor stared at the board as if it had betrayed him. His king sat boxed in by his own pieces, guarded by walls he had built too proudly, too fast. What had once looked secure now felt suffocating. He lifted a hand, then dropped it again. That can't be right, he muttered. His voice cracked slightly. I still have, he counted, once, twice, a third time. Each line ended the same way. The crowd didn't speak. They watched. The older man folded his arms slowly. Every escape square is covered, he said. He sacrificed space early to take it all later. A woman near the table pressed a hand to her mouth. So, it means he's done, someone whispered. The father took another step closer, his polished confidence now completely gone. He stared at the board, eyes moving desperately, as if he could will a solution into existence. Move. The neighbor snapped suddenly, looking up at his son's father instead of his opponent. You see something? Move. No one answered him. The young man waited. The neighbor tried one last thing. A piece slid forward weakly. More hope than strategy. The sound it made against the square was hollow. The young man didn't even hesitate this time. His queen moved. Not dramatically, not forcefully. It glided into place. Calm as breath, the older man spoke at the exact same moment as the piece stopped. Checkmate. The word landed heavier than the first. A sound broke out, someone inhaling sharply. Another person's glass slipping from their fingers and clinking loudly against the table. The neighbor's hands froze midair, his face drained of color. No, he whispered. No, that's not. He leaned forward as if proximity alone might change the board. Then he leaned back, shoulders slumping as the truth closed. There was nowhere to go. The king was trapped. The game was over. Silence swallowed the crowd. Hold up, not the awkward kind, the reverent kind. Phones were still recording, but no one spoke. No one laughed. The moment demanded respect, whether they wanted to give it or not. The young man sat still, hands folded, eyes on the board, not his opponent, not the crowd. The neighbor swallowed, throat working soundlessly. He trailed off, then let out a shaky laugh. I didn't even see it. The older man nodded once. That's because he didn't force you, he said. He invited you. The neighbor looked up at the young man, now really looked for the first time. You let me walk into it, he said quietly. The young man finally met his gaze. You walked on your own. The words were calm. Unavoidable. The father's breath hitched. He stared between the board and his son, a lifetime of assumptions unraveling with every second that passed. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Round them, the crowd shifted, not in excitement, in recalibration. They had come to watch a lie get exposed. Instead, they had watched truth corner arrogance and end it cleanly. The older man stepped closer to the table, his attention unwavering. That endgame, he said to the young man, wasn't from memory. The young man shook his head slightly. It was inevitable. The older man studied him, impressed now without reserve. You saw that 20 moves ago, before the first sacrifice, the young man replied. Another silence followed, deeper this time. Then the neighbor stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly behind him. He looked around, as if expecting the room to laugh again. No one did. The humiliation he tried to engineer had reversed direction completely and hit him full in the chest. The young man rose from his seat calmly. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply stepped back, giving space as if returning something borrowed. Behind him, a quiet sound clicked. The locksmith. Everyone turned. The man stood by the door, keys in hand, uncertain where to look. He said softly. Before we continue, sir, I just need to confirm ownership. The father turned slowly. The neighbor said nothing. All eyes moved to the young man. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his keys. They were all ready. In his hand, the lock clicked once. Clean and final. The door opened easily. No force. No damage. Just truth. And that was when the room finally understood. The chessboard had only been the beginning. The lock clicked. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But in the silence that followed, it sounded like a verdict. The door swung inward smoothly, revealing the soft glow of clean light inside the house-wide space. High ceilings, calm order. Not staged. Lived in carefully, quietly. No alarms. No resistance. No apology from the door itself. The locksmith released a breath he'd been holding. Ownership confirmed, he said, almost respectfully now. The keys match perfectly. A murmur moved through the crowd, low and unsettled. The father stood frozen at the threshold. His hands, once so confident, hung uselessly at his sides. He stared into the house as if it might vanish if he blinked. You. His voice broke. You really? The young man didn't finish the sentence for him. He stepped aside, wordlessly, allowing everyone a clear view inside. Not as an invitation, but as evidence. The neighbor took a step back, rubbing the side of his face, eyes fixed on the floor now. The swagger he'd worn so easily had drained away, leaving only embarrassment and disbelief. A woman whispered, "He bought it alone." Another voice answered, hushed. "Did you see how small he made himself earlier?" The father turned slowly toward his son. He searched his face, this time desperately for signs of the boy he thought he knew. Someone uncertain, someone needing approval. He found none. "Why didn't you tell us?" the father asked, the question raw now, stripped of accusation. The young man paused. Not for effect, for honesty. "You never asked," he said quietly. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. The father staggered back half a step, like he'd taken a physical blow. His mouth opened and closed again, struggling to reshape a reality that no longer fit his assumptions. The mother covered her mouth, eyes filling. She moved forward finally, hesitation breaking, and touched her son's arm. "You did this by yourself?" she whispered. He nodded. Her shoulders shook, not from pride alone, but from grief for all the years she hadn't known how heavy his silence had been. Behind them, the older man, the one who had spoken with certainty during the game, cleared his throat gently. The sound cut through the tension without breaking it. "I hope you'll forgive my intrusion," he said, stepping closer. "But I should introduce myself properly." A few heads turned. Recognition sparked in some eyes. "I work with academic programs," he continued calmly, "and competitive circles. What I saw tonight," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "was rare." The father stiffened, still stunned. "Rare, yes," the man replied. "Not just skill, discipline, restraint, character." The young man lowered his gaze again, uncomfortable now for the first time all evening. "I wasn't trying to prove anything," he said. The older man smiled faintly. "That's exactly why it was convincing." The neighbor let out a strained laugh, shaking his head. "You could have said something," he muttered. "Saved me the embarrassment." The young man looked at him, not unkindly. "You didn't ask either." That ended the conversation. The older man turned to the young man. "I'd like to speak with you privately," he said. "When you're ready." The implication hung in the air. Opportunity, recognition, doors opening that had nothing to do with locks. The crowd began to shift again, but this time the energy was different. No one rushed away. They lingered, recalibrating how they stood, how they spoke. Some nodded respectfully as they passed him. Some avoided his eyes altogether. The father remained still. "Son," he said finally. The words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth now. "I was wrong." It was the first honest thing he'd said all evening. The young man considered him for a long moment. Then he spoke, not loudly, not dramatically. "I didn't need you to be proud," he said. "I just needed you not to doubt me in front of everyone." The father bowed his head. No defense came this time. No excuses. Only silence and shame. The young man stepped fully inside his home at last. Standing just beyond the threshold, he didn't close the door. He simply turned, looked at all of them one final time, and said, "We're done here." The words weren't cruel. They were complete. Behind him, the house waited. And outside, everything had changed. Applause started awkwardly. One pair of hands. Then another. Then a few more, uncertain, delayed, as if everyone was waiting for permission to acknowledge what had already been decided. The young man didn't look back at them. He stood just inside the doorway, fingers resting lightly against the frame, listening to the sound swell and then fade on its own. He neither accepted it nor rejected it. He simply let it pass through the space and dissolve. "Don't," he said quietly. The clapping stopped immediately. Outside, the crowd felt suddenly exposed, as if noise had been their last shield and it had been taken from them. People shifted, embarrassed now by how eagerly they had laughed earlier. The older man stepped forward again, slower this time, with respect. "You handled that with restraint," he said. "Most people would have wanted witnesses. You wanted resolution." The young man nodded. "Once. I just wanted it to be over. I'd still like to offer you something," the man continued. "Coaching, sponsorship, a platform. If you want it." The young man considered it, truly considered it, eyes lowering, breath slowing. The past flickered behind his eyes. Long nights, quiet rooms, sacrifices no one had counted. "Let me think," he said. "I've built my life quietly. I don't want to tear it open just to prove a point." The older man smiled. "That may be the strongest choice you make yet." Behind them, the neighbor had retreated to the edge of the crowd. His voice was gone, his presence reduced to someone people no longer made space for. He stared at the ground, phone dark in his hand, a device meant to humiliate, now holding nothing worth posting. The father remained where he was. He looked years older than he had an hour ago when he finally spoke. It wasn't to the crowd. It wasn't to defend himself. It was quiet, earnest, and far too late to undo the damage, but not too late to acknowledge it. "I built my name by being loud," he said, "and I mistook noise for strength." The young man met his eyes. "This house," the father continued, voice tight, "you didn't buy it to impress us, no." The young man replied, "I bought it to breathe." That was the moment things settled. No dramatic embrace. No forgiveness speech. No viral quote shouted into a camera. Just truth, finally said out loud. The mother stepped forward and hugged her son, carefully, as if afraid he might disappear again. He held her briefly, firmly, and then stepped back. "I'll call you," he said gently. Not a promise, not a rejection, just space. One by one, people began to leave. Their departure had none of the earlier confidence. They walked away quieter, slower, some thoughtful, some ashamed. Some changed just enough to recognize humility when they saw it. The older man exchanged a final nod with the young man and followed. Soon, the driveway was empty. The locksmith packed his tools in silence and left without a word. The sun dipped lower, light spilling across the floor inside the house. The young man closed the door at last, not angrily, not triumphantly, but carefully. Inside, the house felt exactly as it should have from the beginning. Peaceful. He walked through the rooms slowly, past the open windows, past the bare walls waiting for meaning, past the chessboard he'd set on a small table near the window, and moved. Since the game ended, he sat down. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to exhale fully. No audience. No judgment. No need to explain. What he had built could not be broken into. Not by locks, not by laughter, not by doubt. True success hadn't been the house or the game or even the moment of recognition. It was this walking away intact,